Well, we are on chapter 22. When we ended chapter 21, Ombrick had shared, we know Pitch's plan, and Toothiana had asked, do we go to Punjab high-low? And Bunnymund said, right speedily. So she sprang to her feet, fluttered her wings, and brandished her swords. Let's fly. Oh gosh. Yeah. Poke these in a little bit here. They don't look like, I don't know. They make it anyway. Chapter 22, To Be Brave. An ominous wind began to blow in Punjab high-low. Pitch looked down at Catherine. She was determined not to look surprised to see him. Thought I was done for, didn't you? He asked in a voice icy with scorn. No, my dear, it's your so-called guardians who will be destroyed. Catherine knew that the Nightmare King fed on fear, particularly the fear of children. And so, that is what children fear. He feeds on that. And so she steeled herself to meet his cold, dark eyes with her own. She reminded herself of when last they'd met, when she'd held up the locket-sized picture of his long-lost daughter. One look at it had made Pitch scream in agony. It had defeated him, caused him and his fearling army to vanish, and his scream had haunted Catherine ever since. She even felt a vague sort of pity for him. That pity gave her courage, and she was sure that Nightlight, North, and the others would soon fly to her rescue. The Guardians battled you in the Himalayas and at the center of the earth, she said evenly, and each time we won the day. Pitch's expression betrayed little. He slid closer to her, his dark cape covering so much of him that it was impossible to tell if he actually walked or if he floated. One thing was apparent. He kept his right hand, the hand that had become flesh, hidden under the cape, and his entire right side seemed stiff, as if underneath the cape he hid a terrible wound. He stood perfectly still. Catherine looked to where his hand was hidden and wondered about the locket. Did he have it still? Did he still have it? Pitch sensed her thoughts. You preyed on my weakness, and that was very clever. He brought his face close to hers. But soon, I'll be rid of any weakness. Your new golden age, he added, his voice becoming a calm whisper, will become the age of nightmares. The monkeys began to screech in unison. They pounded their paws against the ancient blocks of stone they sat upon. One of them swung paw over paw down from the top of the ruins and landed in front of Pitch. Where is your king? Pitch asked blankly. The monkey muttered a reply. Left behind? Said Pitch, with a trace of amusement. Betrayed by his own? All the better. Do you have the relic? The animal held up a pouch. From within this small sack, there came a bright red glow emanating from the ruby box snatched from Queen Toothiana. Catherine recognized that glow. It was the same glow she'd seen coming from the orb of North's sword and on Bunnymund's egg-tipped staff. It was the glow of an ancient lunar relic. She immediately averted her gaze, not wanting to arouse Pitch's suspicions as to the box's importance, but she realized this must be what gave Queen Toothiana whatever powers she possessed. Was this what Pitch was after? Hoping to distract him, she blurted out, "You'll fail. You always do." Pitch drew himself up, growing ever taller until he towered above her, and then he leaned over, his icy breath in her face. The air suddenly felt as cold as Siberia in winter. Too late, Catherine realized her mistake. She had insulted Pitch's intelligence. Drat. She should have let him keep talking, let him talk all night, give her friends the time they needed to get to her. But what do I know? Catherine stammered, trying to placate him. You're the Nightmare King, and I'm just a girl. Pitch permitted himself a small smile. That's exactly right. The man in the moon's toys are of some use to me, but the prize I seek is of greater value, much greater. With it, I can make an undefeatable army. What prize is that? Catherine asked, using her sweetest, most innocent voice. Pitch stared at her, but said no more. Catherine had to keep him talking. She had to. She had to trick him into revealing his plan. It was vital. She racked her brain for a compliment that he might believe, a compliment that would make him want to tell all, just so that he could boast. You've been brilliant in coming up with ways to thwart us, like sneaking into North's gin or creating armor from the Earth's core, she said. North's genie, gin. Same thing, it's a different word. Like sneaking into North. If you remember, he snuck into the genie that North created and took it over him. Why, I can't begin to imagine how astounding and dreadful this new prize will be. Then she held her breath, waiting while Pitch considered her words. His eyes lit up. Catherine's heart pounded. Pitch's need to boast would win out over his need for caution, she thought to herself. She did not realize was that her lost tooth, which she held tightly in her hand, had begun to glow almost as brightly as the ruby-carved box. Before she knew what had happened, the tooth was harshly snatched from her hand. A monkey soldier shuffled away from her, clutching the tooth. He tossed it to Pitch, who caught it easily with his left hand. He wrapped his fist around the tooth and pressed it against his forehead. His eyes closed. He began to chuckle with diabolical glee. He was reading her tooth's memories. Stop, stop, Catherine cried. Those are my memories. But a pair of monkeys sprang upon her, holding her tight, keeping her from attacking Pitch. His eyes stayed shut as if sleeping, and he saw every memory of hers he needed. When at last he opened his hand again, the tooth was black and rotted. It turned to dust and blew away in the wind. Desperate, Catherine reached for the dust, but it was gone. She sank to the ground. She felt so lost and alone. She began to clutch the compass around her neck. It was the first gift that North had ever given to her, a compass with an arrow that pointed to a single letter, N, to North himself. Catherine had once used it to find North and Ombrick in the Himalayas, and now she was absolutely sure it would show her that North was on his way to rescue her. Together, they would put an end to this nightmare man, but before she could look, Pitch crooked one of his long black fingers and the compass flew to him. His eyes still closed. He held the compass for a moment, then lobbed it at her feet. Your North isn't coming, he said, an edge of triumph in his voice. The arrow isn't moving. Pitch had learned enough of Ombrick's magic to damage the compass, and now he also knew Catherine's most precious memories as well as many things about her and the Guardians, and he was quite sure he now knew how best to defeat them all. Catherine grabbed the compass back. She stared at it in disbelief. The arrow spun uselessly, pointing nowhere. Why weren't North and the others on their way? They've abandoned you, their precious Catherine, to me. His voice turned smooth and cunning as he pretended to comfort her. Your rightful place is at my side. Everyone's known that from the very moment you reminded me that I once had a daughter. I lost her, just like you lost your parents. Catherine winced. Don't, she cried. Please, please don't. Fighting back tears, she pressed North's compass to her heart. She closed her eyes and tried to recite Ombric's first spell. I believe, but doubts flooded her mind. She'd never recover her memories of her parents. She'd never know if they had loved her with the same fierce love that Pitch harbored for his daughter. An empty feeling filled her soul. You long for that, don't you? He asked. For the love of a parent, a father. I can give that to you. His voice was low and coaxing. The locket, you know the one. It has your face in it now. You've seen it in your dreams, haven't you? Catherine shook as doubt and fear coursed through her. She had seen it. She'd had that nightmare of being Pitch's daughter. You couldn't count on your parents, Pitch continued, his eyes once again glittering. They left you when you were just a baby. What kind of parents do that? And your friends, your guardians, why? You can see for yourself that they aren't coming. Pitch pointed to the compass again. The arrow still hadn't budged. Without me, you'd be alone, abandoned again. Suddenly, Pitch swirled around. The monkeys, whose chant had been drumming quietly in the background, now began to screech. With a ghoulish laugh, Pitch flew off a trail of black smoke into the night, leaving Catherine alone, more alone than she had ever been in her young life. Chapter 23, in which the guardians fly to Punjab High-Low. Back in the lunar Lomidary. Keep saying Lamidary. Back in the lunar Lomidary, North was filling Toothiana in on the best ways to battle Pitch. If we surprise him, we will have an advantage, he told her. Toothiana and her 6 mini-selves understood. They took to the sky. Nightlight started after her, then stopped, looking over his shoulder at the other guardians. Toothiana made a trill-like noise, and the mini-selves hovered in mid-flight too. Go, Bunnyman urged. I'll tunnel the rest of us there. Pitch will be watching the skies, Ombric mused. If we come from both air and underground, we may surprise him. Queen Toothiana nodded sharply and set off toward Punjab High-Low. Nightlight on her heels and her 6 mini-selves flying just ahead, they moved on. The train was ready, filled with Yetis and lunar llamas and the villagers. If the guardians were surprised to see the villagers already on the train, they didn't take the time to say so. Paul William, Fogg, Petter, and all the children were aboard, as were North's elves. Bunnyman walked toward the front, North dragging the Monkey King after him. He shackled him to a door in the engine car. You might make a useful bargaining chip, your royal monkeyness, North growled. Just don't cause any trouble. North and Ombric stood at the controls in the front car as Bunnyman readied himself near the tip of the digging device. Let's get going, Bunnymund, North urged. We've got to move. Bunnymund turned to his friends. He held a particularly large chocolate egg in one paw. It's time to unleash the inner puka, he said with a flourish. Then he swallowed the chocolate whole. North grimaced. Oh boy, I've never seen what's going to happen. I'm never sure what's going to happen when he gets nutty with the chocolate. He told me that once he grew an extra head, Ombric offered cheerfully, and indeed, Bunnymund began to twist and grow and change with alarming suddenness, and before they could tell if he'd grown anything extra, he became a giant blur of digging. Even for a puka, He was moving astonishingly fast. All they could see in front of them was a blizzard of dirt and rocks. At the same time, Ombrick's beard and eyebrows began to twirl. He was finally sensing bits of thoughts from Catherine. He was most concerned. The thoughts that made it through to him were full of despair. North sensed this too, but he had more immediate concerns. We've never had a crazier plan, he confided to Ombrick. Nicholas, we have what we need, brave hearts and sharp minds, Ombrick reminded him. And as you might recall, we always abandon our plans and end up doing things we never imagined. North smiled. The old man still had a thing or two to teach him. The old man still had a thing or two to teach him. Chapter 24. Anger, despair, and a wisp of hope. Catherine hugged her knees to her chest and tried to quell the feeling of hopelessness that was starting to overwhelm her. Sweat formed on her temples and on her upper lip. She felt as if disaster was closing in, and indeed it was. The monkeys dropped down from the ruined walls and formed a circle around her. She tried to block out their howling, but it grew louder and more insistent as the animals came closer. Her heart seemed to be beating to the rhythm of their chant. Where are my friends? They have to know where I am by now. She gazed at the compass and its motionless arrow. North was not on his way to rescue her, and her tooth, its memories, were lost forever. She'd never felt such rage. Catherine got to her feet and glared at the monkeys. They were spinning faster and faster in a circle around her, chanting louder and louder. She covered her ears and screamed, Stop it, stop it. But the monkeys' grins only widened, and then they resumed their shrieking chant. Catherine sank to her knees, gripping the compass in her hand. She didn't know what to do. Where is North? Where is Nightlight? How can they not have come to get me? And the despair overtook the anger, overtook the outrage, overtook the reason. Why did my parents die when I was too young to remember them? Maybe it would be easier to give up, she thought, to go along with Pitch and his darkling daughter, become his darkling daughter. At least this terrible pain would go away. She looked up at the sky and tried to make out the man in the moon's face, but swirling clouds blocked him out. It was as if even the man in the moon had turned his back on her. Maybe it would be easier to give up, to go along with Pitch and become his darkling daughter. At least this terrible pain would go away. Ignoring the monkeys, Catherine began to scratch the ground with her fingers. The dirt was soft, and soon she'd made a small hole. She paused for a moment, then dropped the compass in. She pressed dirt over it. Then she curled up and lay upon the small mound. I'm tired of fighting, she thought. I don't want to grow up. I'm tired of fighting. I don't want to grow up. A breeze stirred the air, and Catherine was glad for at least that, at least a moment of coolness. And that's when she saw in the distance what appeared to be a hummingbird making its way toward her. Chapter 25. A brief exchange as the watchful are watched. As Nightlight and Toothiana flew toward Punjam Hilo, the wind and clouds seemed to be moving with them. For the second time in as many days, Nightlight had the feeling he was being watched. Toothiana, he noticed, was glancing about from side to side as if she felt the same. Nightlight tried to see if Toothiana could hear his thoughts. Are you having this watching feeling? He asked her in thought. For a moment, she did not respond. But just when he decided she didn't share the same gift he and the guardians did, she turned her head in her sudden bird-like way and looked at him in the eye, her glorious wings never missing a beat. I do, quiet boy, she said above the wind. I've felt, quote, the watching many times. She is a mystery, but she is always there, in the wind, the rain, the snow, the thunder and the lightning. I do not know if she is bad or good, but what interest she has in the battle to come, I cannot say. Chapter 26, The Reckoning. There was a strange moment as they approached Punjab Hilo. Every guardian felt it, including Toothiana. They no longer wanted to merely defeat Pitch or imprison him or send him into exile. They wanted him to die. Because of rage or sorrow or hate or revenge or even cold, calculated logic, they wanted to kill him. It was a dark reckoning. Each of them looked for the moon, hoping that their friend and leader would tell them what to do. But a storm had blackened the skies, and they were on their own. Chapter 27. Can a puka grow 6 arms? The journey was extremely swift. The first car of the egg-shaped train popped quietly above the earth near the peak of Punjab Hilo. North unshackled the Monkey King, grasped him by the neck, and dragged him out. The Cossack's sword was aglow. Ombric climbed out right behind him. Bunnymun motioned for them to be quiet, and quiet they were. Dumbfounded, actually, for Bunnymund was a hulking mess, covered with layers of mud and pulverized rock that made him look more like a statue than a giant rabbit. His cloak was gone, torn to nothingness, but what was most surprising, the chocolate he'd eaten had turned him into a massive, muscular warrior version of himself, and as an extra little surprise, he now had 6 arms, 3 on each side. But the chocolate did to Bunnymun. North frowned. This is too odd, even for me. Oh, don't worry, replied Bunnymun cheerfully. I'll go back to being by-armed when we're done. Then he shushed North with all 3 right hands. North thought the gesture pointless. How could they be heard above the strange chanting that echoed through the dense jungle? They looked around. The darkness was nearly total. Not a star shined through what seemed to him ominous clouds, and the wind seemed to be blowing in gusts in every direction. Toothiana and Nightlight flew down from the topmost branches of a huge banyan tree to join them. Just ahead, in a clearing, Toothiana said quietly, Catherine. Any fearlings? Asked North. Toothiana shook her head. Monkeys. An army of monkeys. Our relics won't have the same effect on creatures of flesh and blood, said Ombric, worried. Pitch is most cunning, said Toothiana. Indeed, replied North, but we can handle them. The monkeys are a dangerous mix, she cautioned. Part man, part animal, the worst parts of each, and they obey no law, not even the jungles. They are an army to be feared. My army, the Monkey King screeched. Silence, North hissed. He threw him to his elves. Guard him, he ordered, then tossing aside his overcoat and using the glowing orb on his sword to light the way, he stormed through the thick, steamy jungle toward the chanting primates. The wind picked up and swirled around them. Toothiana knew the way, so she sped ahead of North to lead them through the vines. They pushed past immense tropical plants and webs of vines for what seemed an eternity until the chanting suddenly stopped. The guardians could tell they were edging into the clearing now. The jungle seemed less dense, and they could just make out the shapes of structures and buildings ahead. North's saber grew brighter, as did the egg at the tip of Bunnymun's staff, but Nightlight kept dim. To do what he had planned, he needed to be stealthy. To do what he had planned, he needed to be stealthy. The relics provided enough light for them to see the monkey army that had gathered along every stone, pile, and tower that filled the city of Punjab High-Low. Toothiana flared her wings and hissed at them. "They are just outside the temple of the flying elephant," she whispered. The guardians pressed forward until they came to a wall of monkeys. The guardians drew their weapons, expecting to be set upon, but to their surprise, the creatures shuffled aside to let them pass. They were armed with all sorts of weapons, daggers, swords, spears, and each was crudely armored. Bunnymun's whiskers twitched. Hitch is quite resourceful in his choice of henchmen, or should I say hench monkeys. North was unimpressed. His sword would make quick work of these monkey boys. With a nod from Toothiana, Nightlight darted past the others and disappeared into the dark. As the others moved past the last layer of monkeys, they could see a single torch shining in the dark just ahead, its flame being battered by the winds. Then they spied Catherine, bound by thick vines and lashed to a post in front of the giant doors of the flying elephant's temple. Behind her stood Pitch. Around his neck hung Toothiana's ruby box. "One step more," warned Pitch, bringing one of his long black fingers to within a hairbreadth of Catherine's cheek, "and I will make her mine." They stopped. The wind picked up. A spider's web of lightning lit the sky. Pitch smiled a sly smile and then roared a command. The monkey army launched its attack. Chapter 28, A Monkey Battle Royale. Toothiana. The monkeys attacked with a fury that surprised even North. The hilt of his sword wrapped itself tightly around his hand, and he slashed at the screaming creatures as they descended upon them. "Do your magic, old man," North shouted to Ombre, hoping the wizard had a spell or two that would help combat this onslaught. North swung left and right, but he missed his mark more often than he wished. With humans, he thought, you can anticipate what they'll do, but these monkeys are insane. Toothiana flew above the fray, expertly wielding her swords, bucking and spinning whenever a monkey landed on her back, trying to rip at her wings. Bunnymun was able to do considerable damage to any simian within reach of his 6 massive arms. All the while, Nightlight was creeping quietly along the top of the temple, staying in the shadows, and with him, Toothiana's 6 tiny selves. They were waiting for their moment. The timbre of the monkey's screeches was deafening, and for every monkey the guardians fell, 3 more seemed to arrive to take its place. They swooped down from the treetops like giant locusts. Their swarms made it nearly impossible to get closer to Catherine, and the heat, the dastardly heat, sweat poured from his brow. North could hardly see. And so he was unaware of the villagers and the Yetis and his elf men dragging the pitiful monkey king with them, joining in the fight. Even the boys, Petter, Fogg, and Tall William, grabbed onto thick vines and swung into the middle of the action, sporting Yeti-crafted daggers. "Free me," the bedraggled king cried out. But his army paid him no mind. They followed Pitch now. Ombrick, for his part, was doing his best to calm the unnerving wind. At one moment, it seemed to favor Pitch and the monkeys, pushing North back as he neared Catherine. But in the next, a blast of air sent a monkey's arrow into the trunk of a banyan tree instead of into North's forehead. Even the huge yetis fought to make headway against the hurricane force gales, but despite trying all his meteorological enchantments, Ombrick failed to still the eerie gusts that coiled and twisted above the combatants. And even with all their manpower, even with all of their weapons, and even with all of Ombrick's wizarding capabilities, the Guardians could not keep up with the monkey horde. It was as if Pitch had called every monkey in the world into his service. Pitch stood back and surveyed the scene with satisfaction. He taunted the Guardians and the monkeys alike, enjoying the chaos he caused. Bravo, he cheered as a monkey catapulted itself toward Toothiana's back. Then he laughed out loud when Toothiana dodged the flying creature and it plummeted to the ground in a broken heap. He smiled with gruesome delight as a trio of monkeys waged a game of catch with Gregor of the Mighty Smile and Sergi the Giggler. They tossed the pair about like toys while the other elves tried to rescue their hapless friends. The Guardians themselves were beginning to stagger with exhaustion. North found he was missing more than he was hitting. Never had he found himself in such a situation. Even Bunnymun could barely lift any of his 6 arms to fight off the endless screeching horde. At last, Ombrick raised up his staff and called out frantically, "Enough! Enough! We are beaten, Pitch!" "Never!" North immediately contested, but he too was incapable of continuing. As if his relic sword had not been attached to his hand, he would surely have dropped it. The monkeys encircled them and readied for the kill. Pitch was delighted. This was exactly what he wanted, for the Guardians and all who followed them to feel defeated. He raised his dark hand and the monkeys froze. They did, however, keep their weapons poised. The Guardians and Toothiana stumbled forward, panting. Bunnyman had to hold up North with one set of arms and Ombrick with the other. "What is it you seek, Pitch?" Ombrick asked, gasping. "The flying elephant," he said simply. Toothiana's eyes narrowed. "He will do only as I command," he told Pitch. "Oh, I know that, Your Highness. Please remind me. What is it you are queen of?" "Ah, yes, a bunch of ruins, a handful of little fairies, and a flying elephant. An elephant that no one ever sees. Not much of a kingdom." Queen Toothiana spread her wings and hissed at Pitch. "Most articulate, Your Highness. Now, bring out the elephant, or I'll take this child." Pitch placed his hand dangerously close to Catherine's brow and blacken her soul forever. Toothiana took a step toward Pitch, her swords still ready. Her face was set. She seemed determined to attack. He gave her a shriveling look. "Oh, my dear girl, your dinner knives can't harm me." At that moment, the Monkey King wrenched himself away from his elf captors and hobbled quickly to Pitch. "Master," he blubbered, "you'll make the elephant give me back my humanity?" Pitch looked down at the pitiful creature and laughed. "No, you fool. I'll ask him to remove all of mine." Get that? "Master," he blubbered, "you'll make the elephant give me back my humanity?" Pitch looked down at the pitiful creature and laughed. "No, you fool. I'll ask him to remove all of mine." The monkey looked almost comically confused. "It's my only imperfection," Pitch went on. "I can feel things, human things. It's my only weakness." He glared at Toothiana. "You should understand that, Your Highness, being half human yourself. Think of what you might accomplish if you didn't have that burden." Toothiana just stared at him. If the elephant can take away all of this miserable creature's weaknesses, he said, pointing to the monkey, then it can surely take away mine. If that is what you wish, Toothiana said evenly. It's the only way you'll get her back, said Pitch, motioning to Catherine. North, his face a storm of fury, called out, "He'll become invulnerable." Toothiana refused to look at North. "I cannot let him harm the child." Then she lowered her weapons and closed her eyes. "Sisters of light, forgive me," she whispered. The guardians gazed up at the wooden statues that ringed the base of the temple. They were magnificent effigies, beautiful winged women standing straight and tall, but frozen forever. If only they could help, moaned Ombrick. The wind calmed somewhat as the massive door of the temple creaked slowly open. At first, they could see only darkness in the temple, then the shuffle of heavy footsteps on the ground. The Dark Surprise, chapter 29. Or all is given for the sake of pity. Take a breath here. It's almost finished with this book. I hate finishing the books. There's another one to come. It was time. The trap was sprung. Everyone knew their part. The flying elephant exploded from its temple, wings outstretched, trunk and tusks raised. It knocked Pitch away from Catherine and pinned him to the ground. At that exact moment, Toothiana leaped to Catherine, and with one slash of her blade, cut the vines that bound her to the post. Her 6 mini-cells flew like darts from their hiding places atop the temple and yanked Toothiana's ruby-carved box from Pitch's neck. The monkey army, momentarily stunned by the surprise attack, quickly recovered and fell upon the guardians, certain they would kill them on the spot they were in for another surprise. "No more play acting," North shouted out, and brandishing his swords with characteristic fury. Bunnymund and Ombrick dropped their exhausted posing and became dervishes of action, knocking out monkeys by the score. The Yetis, elves, and citizens of Santoff Clausen followed suit. It had all been an act. They weren't beaten at all. The battle became feverish within seconds, but there were more surprises yet. Toothiana grabbed her ruby relic from her mini cells, held it to her chest, and repeated the call she'd made only once before. "Mother, Father, help me." No sooner had she spoken these words than hundreds, no thousands of mini versions of herself began to stream from her like waves of light. They swarmed the monkeys like an endless army of hornets, their tiny swords and arrows slicing the monkeys to ribbons. Pitch struggled against the elephant's weight, and from the roof of the temple, Nightlight took careful aim. The final blow would come from his staff. Catherine knew what was coming. Out of one of Toothiana's mini cells had flown to her outside the temple and told her every detail of Guardian's bold plan. Now that Catherine was free from Pitch's clutches, he would die. In a moment, Nightlight's diamond-tipped staff, sharper than any spear and the only weapon that had ever pierced the villain's heart, would do so once more. All around was the crazy havoc of battle. Monkeys, yetis, wizard, villains, and the heroes were locked in a battle to the death, everyone but Catherine. She stood still, looking down at Pitch. In that moment, he knew her thoughts. He knew that his doom was an instant away. Catherine saw fear in his eyes. There was one thing she must know before the end. So she did something that was not in the plan. Chapter 30. The Winds of Change. Nightlight blinked. He couldn't throw his staff. Catherine was in the way. Move, he thought as hard as he could, but Catherine did not answer. He knew that something was terribly wrong. As fast as his considerable powers would propel him, he flew, but the disaster unfolded faster than could be reckoned with. Catherine stared at Pitch's hand. Its flesh color had spread up his arm all the way to the shoulder, but that's not what held her mesmerized. It was the locket. In his hand, Pitch still gripped the locket. In fact, the locket seemed to have fused to his fingers, become a part of him. The same locket that she had shown him at the Battle of the Earth's core, the locket that had carried a picture of Pitch's lost daughter. But whose picture would be in it? Would Catherine's face be there? Would her nightmare become true? It took all her courage to look, and then she saw. The picture was almost gone. Only scraps of it remained. Pitch had clearly tried to tear it away, but Catherine could see just enough to know that it was the old image of Pitch's daughter. She felt a sort of relief, but then she looked in Pitch's eyes again. They were so anguished, afraid, lost in pain. He doesn't deserve to die, she thought. Even the worst villain needs pity. He was a father and a hero once. He did not chart his past or present. What Catherine felt, that strange mix of revulsion and sorrow that overwhelmed her, was instantly felt by all the guardians. What Catherine felt, that strange mix of revulsion and sorrow that overwhelmed her, was instantly felt by all the guardians. Then Pitch's other hand reached out and grabbed hers. Her eyes widened. Pitch's touch was unexpectedly gentle. Nightlight tried to break Pitch's hold on Catherine, but before he could do so, the wind picked up again, gusts of it whipping through the clearing, bending trees in half, ripping leaves from their branches. The sky darkened faster than any of them ever experienced before. A swirling mass of clouds broke through the treetops and descended into the clearing. In the midst of it all was a tall, cloaked woman who held herself with a regal air. And grinned for surprise. Her face was long yet lovely, and years older than they remembered from the picture they had seen. Icy nuggets of hail and bolts of lightning churned around her as the cloud mass moved toward Pitch and Catherine, then engulfed them. Then, as suddenly as the cloud had arrived, it was gone, and with it, Catherine and Pitch. The monkey army had scrambled back to the jungle. All who remained stood there speechless. Catherine was gone. They'd failed. North was the first to gather his wits. That woman in the cloud, Pitch's daughter? Holmberg looked at Nightlight. He did not have to ask the question out loud for Nightlight to understand. Nightlight shimmered a response. But his answer was one that Holmberg never expected. He turned to Toothiana. She nodded. The old wizard blinked rapidly, processing what he'd just learned. North cleared his throat impatiently. Spit it out, old man. Holmberg tugged at his beard once, then a second time. Then at last he said, She has another name, apparently. By some, she's known as Mother Nature. Pitch's daughter had become Mother Nature. Bunnymun's left ear twitched, then his right one did the same. I've encountered this being before, said the Pooka. She's not always a benevolent soul, and she is very unpredictable. The villagers, the children, the Yeti, all of them gathered. The guardians looked to the coming dawn, bound by one emotion, not fear or hate or vengeance. It was that feeling of pity Catherine had for Pitch. Toothiana spoke what everyone was feeling. We didn't fail, but we did lose our way. We wanted to kill, she said softly. We did lose our way. We wanted to kill. We were no better than Pitch, perhaps worse, said Ombrick. But Catherine remembered, said North quietly. So they stood on the peak of Punjam Hilo, weary but alive, and certain of one thing. Catherine's strength had been greater than theirs, and they hoped and believed that this strength would keep her safe past the dawn of this new day. And that's the end of this book. And as it says here, to be continued. And the continuation is the next book in The Guardians of Childhood. And the title of that book, which we will begin soon, is The Sandman and the War of Dreams. The Sandman and the War of Dreams. So another guardian to be introduced. The Sandman. The one we rub our eyes in the morning, who visit us in our sleep. And the subtitle is featuring the desperate mission to save Catherine and the appearance of a wayward lad of considerable interest named Jackson Overland Frost. Till then, friends.